back to our 6 challenges. I think that's the first one, tick in the box. Yes?
Checked.
We'll tick the box. I don't know what check the box means. We're ticking the box. So now, where is it? I think we're going to get a tick appearing in there. So we're going to move on to the second one. GDPR. This is meaty, serious, important, complicated. How are we going to fix that?
Okay, so...
Okay, look, do you know what? I knew this would happen. We're going to help Brian out, and also to help you guys out. We've made a short film just to explain, in brief detail, before we bring the others out, a little bit more about GDPR. So let's run that first.
Thank you.
Help you out.
The internet is barely a quarter of a century old, but in that short time, it has transformed every aspect of our lives. Despite its positive influence, the digital revolution has left people rightfully concerned about their personal privacy. To address these concerns, the European Union has adopted the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which governs the use of personal assets, including unique online identifiers and IP addresses. No sector will be affected by GDPR more than digital advertising, which relies on such assets to help marketers engage consumers, and digital publishing, which is funded in large part by advertising. GDPR will cause massive changes to the way companies do business. Companies that have the resources and structural capacity to build compliance systems will reinvent digital advertising in Europe. Companies that cannot, or will not, face 2 choices: work with a compliant technology partner, or get locked out. AppNexus is uniquely equipped to meet this challenge in 3 important ways. Our marketplace and enterprise products sit atop a unified technology platform. We aren't a point solution. We can control and guard the flow of our customer data on our technology stack. We enjoy direct relationships with Europe's leading digital publishers. Advertisers can access that premium supply with our sophisticated and safe buy-side tools. Finally, we have pre-existing data center architecture inside Europe. GDPR is complicated, but we're approaching it from multiple angles. We will review the partners with whom we work either directly or through our customer relationships. For partners we trust, we will impose enhanced requirements governing the use of data on and off our technology stack. We will no longer work with partners that cannot or will not comply with our requirements. In close partnership with our customers, we are building tools to meet GDPR's enhanced transparency, choice, and consent requirements. Last, we will expand our European data center architecture to ensure that data originating in Europe stays in Europe. AppNexus is leading the way on GDPR compliance, because a privacy-safe internet is a better internet.
Yes, please.
Clap the film there. Good. I think that's okay. We can carry on. Look, now we know a little bit more about it. How are we going to fix it?
Well, I think you heard it. I think we are 100% committed to being as ready for GDPR as possible. I compare this to Y2K. Many of us who were around in the 90s, spent 5 years seeing everyone panic about the Y2K issue. And then on January 1st, 2000, we all woke up, hungover, and said, nothing happened. I would love it if next May, we have the same reaction, that we all over-prepared. But my sense is that while many of our partners and clients here in Europe are very concerned, we haven't seen the sense of urgency from the broader ad tech ecosystem that we'd hoped for. So I want to remind you that you do need multiple data centers in Europe if you want to actually be able to fail over without violating GDPR. That's a major investment that many ad tech companies haven't made. You need to review every single system and data pipeline. There's a ton of work. And I know that we're starting now to be well ahead of this, and we'd strongly encourage you, if you're not an ad tech company, to ask every vendor you work with what they're doing, are they prepared, and are they taking this as seriously as we all are.
Okay, perfect. Well, look, let's keep this moving. We've got a panel of experts we're going to bring out. So to introduce the panel and to take the topic further, it's our pleasure to introduce the founding editor of Business Insider, Jim Edwards.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I think the panel should join me. We've got Julia Shullman of AppNexus, Yves Schwarzbart of IAB, Ingvild Naess of Schibsted, and Scott Meyer of Evidon. So yesterday, actually, I was attending the executive committee of a major global business news publisher. I won't say which one, but you can probably figure it out. And I asked the people in the room, most of whom were Americans, how many knew what GDPR was, and basically almost nobody knew. And the prevailing feeling was, I think, you know, well, we're American, and you're British, and you just had Brexit, you're leaving the EU, so this obviously won't apply to us, right? And it turns out the answer is wrong. And before we get into the discussion, I just want to take a completely anonymous, off-the-record show of hands. How many of you actually know what GDPR does or will do to your business? Very few. Keep your hand in the air if you think your company is prepared or already preparing for GDPR. Okay, it's like 10% of you. Okay, so there's a lot of challenges. So why don't I start with you, Yves? Just very high-level bullet points. What have we got to do?
Sure. I mean, I'll try and keep it short. I guess it's worth remembering that data protection rules have been around for a very long time. This is what the GDPR actually does, is update current rules, which in theory sounds great because the GDPR's main aim is to actually harmonize data protection rules across Europe. And currently there's a patchwork of different rules, and it makes it very difficult for businesses actually to operate in multiple markets. However, when you look at obviously the devil is in the detail. When you look at the detail, it gets a bit scary at times. So just to sort of, some of the headlines, basically, it's worth remembering that the GDPR kicks in from the 25th of May 2018. So we've just got over 12 months left really to prepare. And I think one of the biggest game changers when it comes to the GDPR are the fines and the enforcement regime that comes with the GDPR. So currently in the UK, to give you an example, the data protection regulator here, the ICO, can issue fines of up to £500,000, which is a lot of money, but it's not necessarily existential. The GDPR very much changes that, and under the GDPR, regulators can actually fine companies up to a minimum of 20 million euros, or up to 20 million euros, or even 4% of their global annual turnover, whichever is greater.
Whichever's greater.
So that's we're talking about a lot of money here.
That is
existential threats.
For a lot of people in the ad tech space, that's a company-killing amount of money, right?
Absolutely. And what's even more important then is, well, what do I have to do to be actually able to comply? And I think particularly for American companies, it's critical to understand that the GDPR, regardless of where they're based, if they want to do business in Europe effectively, in the EU, the GDPR will apply to them. So they will have to remember and they will have to know what to do. And I also think what is perhaps a very American specific topic is that in America, or even us as an industry here in the UK, we often talk about, is it PII or is it non-PII? That is actually a very American concept. It's not a European concept. In Europe, what matters is whether you process personal data, and that's what the GDPR is all about. And the definition of personal data is critical. So it isn't just name or address. In many ways, regulators already think that personal data, that an IDFA can be personal data, that IP addresses can be personal data, etc. So in some ways, the GDPR is an evolution from existing rules, but in many ways, particularly when it comes to fines and the fact that it applies to companies wherever they're based effectively, are real game changers.
And it's not just your own company, though, right? You have, because it covers data that you transfer or share with third parties and partners and people in the ad tech stack. All your partners have to be compliant at the same time. Julia, can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, no, that's correct, and I think that's the challenge, is that especially as an open platform, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of different companies plugged into our platform on the buy side, sell side, and data side. So we need to take inventory of all of them and determine how they're using that data and whether our clients like Schibsted are comfortable working with all of those players and passing along the personal data of their end users to these different partners. And I think that's going to be the game changer, is who is going to have access to that data and how they're going to be using it.
Ingvild, how comfortable are you with all your partners?
Yeah, I think that's the key question, because I think a really key element of the GDPR is the focus on transparency and user empowerment. We basically now have to communicate clearly to our end users what data we have, how do you use it, who do we share it with, etc. And not only that, we have to give you some users some options to decide, are they comfortable with that or not? And I think that it maybe doesn't seem to be that extensive, but in practice, this is extremely extensive. And this basically means that we first have to keep track over the data who we share it with, how we use it, etc., and really assess, is this something that our users will be happy with or not? So I think that it definitely requires all of us to work together. This isn't something that publishers or even ad tech companies can solve on their own. We basically have to find solutions, sit together, and then we can present it to the end users.
And becoming compliant, it's going to require engineering and development and real resources. It's not just, oh, we'll let the general counsel's office deal with it, right, Scott?
That's right. So I think the big change, everyone in here has heard of the cookie law, right? And you've seen these cookie banners that in many cases don't do much. They now have to do a lot of things. And so there's the change from an engineering organization where legal tends to be something that you'll bring in at the end and try to get them to just bless it. You really have to engage them now. And engineers will be frustrated because there aren't enough specifics about the whole, I mean, there's 99 articles in this regulation. What you have to focus on is a couple things. Number one is, what's the most visible piece to the regulator? And then if I'm a publisher, it's do I have that visibility into my supply chain so I can be accurate and get consent and transparency for users. If for ad tech, it's knowing who are my partners and where am I in the stack. And because, yes, as an ad tech player, you're not going to be able to force through and start firing off hundreds of different consent disclosures through sites you don't even know you're on. But it is about knowing which partners you work through and ensuring that you're showing up in places that are safe. I think that's a lot of the logic behind what AppNexus announced yesterday, because this is going to possibly tilt the playing field against shadier companies. If you don't have real clarity into who your partners are and how you both collect the data and how you end up targeting users, you will be in trouble.
But also, obviously, it's kind of good that regulations might tilt the field against shadier companies, but I've also got to think it's going to tilt the playing field against smaller companies, more disruptive startups with just a small amount of funding, who are not going to have the resources yet to implement some of this stuff. I mean, when you're a startup, hiring a general counsel's office and hiring a compliance department and stuff like that, that is often years into your plan.
Absolutely, but that's not what this is calling for. But it is calling for the CEO and the CTO and the head of sales to actually just give it a think. Because, yeah, I mean, it's almost like, you know how in HR, you're like, oh, we'll hire an HR person when we get to 50 people. But if you never have anybody helping you on HR up until that point, you could end up with a lawsuit on your hands. It's in those early stages, you have to have an attorney on the outside. You don't need a full-time general counsel to do this. You need to have some resources, including your trading partners, the publishers you count on, and your investors and your attorneys should be able to give you some guidance on this so it doesn't become this astronomical expense. But I will guarantee you, your tech platform and your publisher clients are going to be asking. So, and an ecosystem will develop of service providers, I'm sure.
Julia, because you probably know this best, people will get sued, right? I mean, there are damages at stake.
We're hoping not.
As a consumer, consumer, I could, under the new regulations, I can sue and win money.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, claims can come in from consumers or from your clients or other parties that are part of that stack. So really the key is understanding where your data is going, how it's being used, and whether you can trust those partners to work with you. And I think on the transparency piece and user choice, publishers are not going to want to be disclosing hundreds of different players on their site. And so the key is sort of understanding who they want to work with and making sure that they get access to the players that they want to work with.
We also shouldn't forget, I think regulators are really gearing up right now, right? Because the fine regime is so different to what it currently is. In many ways, data protection laws, or the GDPR elevates data protection laws to the point of where they're almost like antitrust laws, right?
Yeah.
The fines are relatively similar. So all of a sudden, these become headlines in the media, et cetera, et cetera. And I think regulators are aware of that.
And when you say gearing up, how alarmist are you being? Because when I think of the European Commission enforcing rules, it's like, oh great, I'll worry about it in 5 or 10 years' time when they finally get their act together. But this is different.
I mean, I guess, and this is a very frustrating answer, and I think that that's something that often happens when you talk about the GDPR. It all depends, right? It depends a little bit on the regulator. So Fortunately, in the UK, we're slightly privileged, I believe, to have a regulator such as the ICO, which normally is very pragmatic and would normally really go after the really bad players in the ecosystem to sort of, go after the ones that can cause the greatest harm. But regulators elsewhere in Europe feel slightly differently about these things and are perhaps, very keen to test the new law with some very well-established players, even though they might be doing all they can to be able to comply with it.
Yeah. Who do you guys think is going to have the hardest time with all this? Who are the weakest players in the chain? Or is there a piece of the ad tech stack that is more vulnerable than anyone else, or is going to have just a more difficult time? Ingvild?
Well, it's hard to say, but I think that the players that think they can solve this alone, they have a problem. Because as I said, we really now have to work together to be able to present sort of the result to the end users. And of course, I think that we have to realize that, as publishers, we will be dependent on working closely with all our partners to know what is going on. And our partners will definitely be dependent on us in order to present to the end users what is going on and give them their choices, because the publishers are the ones that are sort of user-facing. And I think that element cannot be underestimated, because I think really a key thing with the GDPR is that it clearly establishes that it's not the publishers, it's not the ad tech companies or whatever company that owns the personal data. It's the user owning the personal data. And that is actually a game changer, I think.
Okay. Scott, I'm going to wrap this up soon, but so I'll give the last word to you. Is there anything good about this? Like, does this create benefits for any of us? My feeling was new rules, it's more complicated. Those of us who are compliant and have our partners and our ducks lined up properly, suddenly our data and what we do becomes more valuable and easier to deal with than the other guys who are going to be a shambles.
Yeah, so we run a governance and compliance company, so for us it's good. But for everybody else, and there will be a lot of shooting of the messenger that we will be receiving as well. So there's another side to it. So
consultants will get rich, I suppose.
Sorry?
Consultants will get rich.
The lawyers and consultants are just killing it right now. It's ridiculous. If you, we're running out of time. What's good? Yeah. So a couple things that are good. So what can be good is this concept of really knowing your supply chain. Because if you think about Procter & Gamble as an example, where their chief marketing officer said the digital media supply chain is a mess, and we're done with a lack of transparency. This is a really important component of that. So that's the first thing. So conceptually, that's very, very good. The other part is that it is about putting the data control in the hands of the user, where it often is not. And it's easy as engineers and technical folks to miss that this is still supposed to be about the user. Not about a quote, a target. Now, the bad, of course, is that it risks tilting the playing field because the largest players in the ad tech space will have a fairly easy time complying because they have the resources and they have the ability to, they have a more active lobbying effort. The key things, there's two key things I want to leave everybody with. The first one is doing nothing is the very dumbest thing you can do. Because it's not like the regulators are going to have this big army of people that are going to be blasting open doors saying, where's the data? They're going to take mid-level people and put them in front of a web browser. All right? And they're going to go through and run a spreadsheet and say, I'm going to these different sites, and we used to own Ghostery, and they're going to use Ghostery or something else and say, who's on there? And are the consent solutions what they're supposed to be or not? So it's like the old joke, you end up in the forest and you run into a bear. With your friend?
There'll just be plaintiffs' lawyers looking for cases, right?
No, I don't think that's what's going to happen. What I think is that the regulators are going to be looking for someone to pop, and you want to make sure you're not on that list. And doing that is not that hard. It's about changing your workflow and just having the discussion. It's not as onerous as you think.
Ingvild?
Yeah, I think that this is happening, so we have to turn it into something positive. And I think that, as I see it, the really main element here is that we can use this to build trust. We are going forward, we are collecting and using more and more data. We will be dependent on our users trusting us, unless they will not give us their data. So I think that it's now crucial that we solve these new requirements in a manner that really focuses on the users. What are good for them, what makes sense for them, and then try to educate the regulators. This is actually in the user's best interest. This is how it should work out for the users. So hopefully we can build trust and get more data and be able to use more data.
Okay, and on that upbeat note, I'm going to draw this to a close. Thank you very much. There's another panel on this topic later.